This is The Armed Forces of Central Asia, a brand new mini-series examining the military and security forces of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. And I'm your host, Michael Hilliard. I'm sure it doesn't come as a surprise to anyone listening, but Central Asia is not an area of the world that gets covered very often, particularly from a defense and security angle, which to me is an absolute crying shame. As when it comes to defense policy and military structures, this region is probably the most complicated, confusing, counterintuitive, and confounding region I have probably ever covered here on the show. This is a region where one of the country's helicopter fleets was directly stolen from one of its neighbors. This is a region where one of these militaries is still utilizing a US-made armored car that was given to Stalin during Lend-Lease. And this is a region where in some cases, the majority of the country's military equipment is actually older than the country using it. But then again, this is also a region where the world's new geopolitical front lines are being drawn. This is a region where single countries can host bases and outposts from Russia, China, India, and US and EU task forces all at the same time. And this is a region where states like China quietly test out their new PMC and surveillance programs, perfecting them here before rolling them out elsewhere. This is a region where the military structures have been both purposely crafted to fail miserably at some tasks, whilst also acting with ruthless efficiency at others. This is a region that is far more interesting than most people assume it will be. And it's the region we're going to be unpacking here with this series. This series will be covering all 5 of this region's militaries across 3 separate episodes, unpacking everything from who these militaries are buying weapons from to the findings of closed-door war studies. However, for the first episode, we're going to be diving into just one of these 5 republics. That one being Tajikistan, as frankly, Tajikistan is a perfect microcosm of all of the issues, oddities, and tactics that you'll see right across the region, making it the perfect starting point for anyone looking to understand these militaries. So let's get into it.
Chapter 1: Tajikistan.
So to start with, let's go through some of the basics. Tajikistan's strategic position is one of the most complex in all of Central Asia, with its politics, security, and terrain dominated by the towering Pannier and Alai mountains. But with the country being so mountainous and difficult to navigate, also comes a lack of infrastructure and economic barriers that have created financial and security divides right across the country. Now, this study is mostly just looking at the 5 Central Asian republics that were once part of the Soviet Union. So, to all of you tuning in from Afghanistan and Mongolia, I'm sorry, and we'll get to you at some point. But out of those 5 republics, Tajikistan ranks 5th amongst the Central Asians, both in various military performance metrics, as well as having the lowest military budget and fewest modern vehicles, which, to give you an idea, almost half of the Tajik's tank force is still operating T-55s, a tank which first entered service into the Soviet Army in 1958. However, it also has some significant advantages as well. It hosts the largest Russian military base anywhere outside the Federation, possesses some of the most defensible territory anywhere in the region, and also receives financial and military support from the EU, China, Russia, the US, Iran, and India, mostly to help Tajikistan in managing its southern border. Although its position in 5th for military spending shouldn't be that much of a surprise, as Tajikistan has the lowest GDP and lowest GDP per capita among the 5 former Soviet republics. And a lot of this is because for decades now, the Tajik economy has been completely centered around just a limited selection of industries, including textiles and agricultural products like cotton, with the other major sector of the economy focused around mining, extracting mostly aluminium, gold, silver, and antimony. But whilst none of that seems out of the ordinary, the industry that has the most significant impact on Dushanbe's defense policy don't actually come from products produced within Tajikistan. In fact, they come from remittances sent back into Tajikistan, mostly from Tajik workers doing basic jobs in Russia, with these remittances now constituting a staggering 51% of the country's total earnings. And why I bring this up so early in the piece is this economic dependency on Russia places Tajikistan in a pretty precarious position, where with the stroke of a pen, Russia could just change its visa policy and wipe out half of the Tajik economy overnight, which, as you can imagine, is probably going to shape how Dushanbe goes about things. With all of these structural issues, they're made even more difficult by the nation's geography. As with 90% of the country's territory being covered by imposing mountain ranges and hostile climates, it makes it very difficult to build industries or supply chains connecting different parts of the country. And it's because of these ranges that we've formed natural barriers that effectively divide the country into 4 distinct quadrants. So let's go through those quadrants and understand the divides here in the country. Now, let's draw a bit of a mental picture for you so you have a relative idea of where everything is in the country. So in your head, I want you to picture a drawing of the side view of a standard cartoon rabbit facing left, with the front legs of the rabbit representing the southwest bulge of the country, the back legs representing the southeast bulge of the country, and the ears of the rabbit going up and slightly back, representing the country's northern state. So with that rabbit in the back of your mind, let's talk about the rabbit's body, which includes the capital, Dushanbe, and the surrounding state, known as the Districts of Republic Subordination, with, oddly enough, the nation's capital being just below where you probably would find the rabbit's brain. And to take us through the regions, I'm thrilled to bring in our first guest, Bruce Pannier, the host of Radio Liberty's Major List podcast, as well as a prolific Central Asia journalist that has been covering the region for decades now. So Bruce, how would you describe the capital and the region around it?
Barely 100 years ago, Dushanbe was a village. As its name suggests, it means Monday, and that was its claim to fame 200 years ago or more. That on Monday you would have a bazaar and people would show up and try to sell or buy whatever they wanted. When you get down to, obviously, it's the capital now, so it's more cosmopolitan than the rest of the country. So that's where the elite has been living. And I should mention at this point, too, that there's always kind of a competition between the North and the South. And again, this is something that the Soviet Union was known for, was that they would pick a lot of the leadership from the North. And that's always been problematic for certainly President Emomali Rahman. He ran against a candidate in 1994 who was from the North. And it was one of the closest presidential elections in Central Asia. And I think that also spooked him because this guy got all the votes from the North. He's always been wary of people in the North. He doesn't see them as solid allies. And then there was the assassination attempt on him in August 1997 at Hojand University in the North for as long as I can remember. They've been critical of Rahman. He's certainly not their guy.
Now, Tajikistan, in contrast with most other Central Asian nations, did not inherit anywhere near the same amount of Soviet infrastructure that some of the other republics did following the dissolution of the USSR. As during the Soviet era, the capital, Dushanbe, was notably underdeveloped relative to some of the other republic capitals, having been assigned a lower priority within the Soviet Union's overarching industrial strategy. After all, with Dushanbe's poor geography and lack of transport infrastructure, it wasn't incredibly appealing for the Soviets to start massive factories out here. Now, the USSR almost always prioritized European parts of the Union, but even within the money that they did send toward the Central Asian region, Moscow directed the majority of that investment towards cities like Tashkent in modern-day Uzbekistan and Alma-Ata, now Almaty, in present-day Kazakhstan, with only a small portion of the regionally directed funds being allocated toward the Tajik SSR. And even when it comes to that small amount of money that did reach the Tajik SSR, the bulk of those investments in industrial projects being funded by Moscow were instead directed toward the northern Sogd region of the country, the ears of our rabbit. And let's talk about the back feet of our rabbit, the Gorno-Badakhshan Autonomous Oblast. Can you take us through what that's like?
Now, that's a different place entirely. It's way up there. You got some of the highest mountains in the world up there in the Pannier Mountains. There's only about not even 250,000 people living in there, even though it's more than 40% of the country. But it's just so jagged and rugged that opportunities for agriculture are very marginal in those kind of areas. Just trying to eke out a living has been real hard.
And it's at this point I want to introduce our second special guest for this piece, Steve Swerdlow. As Steve is an associate professor of the practice of human rights in the Department of Political and International Relations at the University of Southern California. On top of that, he's also a senior Central Asia researcher at the Human Rights Watch, heading the organization's work on Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, as well as founding its Kyrgyzstan field office. So Steve, how would you describe the GBAO?
The fascinating thing about Gorno-Badakhshan Autonomous Oblast is its history and its trajectory, which has been really distinct in the history of both Soviet Tajikistan and modern Tajikistan. It was created as an autonomous republic even before it was incorporated into Tajikistan in the Soviet period in the late 20s. This is probably the most far-flung region from Moscow during the Soviet period. And because of the great difficulties the Bolsheviks had in effectuating their conquest of Central Asia, I think they were constantly concerned about maintaining control and support of this far-flung region. One of the reasons that this identity, again, distinct from the rest of Tajikistan, this ethno-linguistic community of Pamiris who adhere to the Ismaili sect of Shia Islam, but also were known for high levels of literacy and education and having intelligentsia. I think that really has always made being a Pamiri very different. And so this is a people that had to develop and did develop very distinctly and independently and really had to take care of themselves. And the difficulties of life during the Civil War and after really meant that this community preserved its distinct identity, their numerous languages, and their different religious traditions.
All of which we'll be going through in more detail later on in the episode. But for now, just keep in the back of your mind that there's a capital that's run by the southern clans, there's a northern region on the other side of the Gisar Range, and then there's Gordo-Badakhshan to the east, in possession of 40% of the country's land, but just 2% of the country's population, with that population being largely ethnically distinct from the rest of the country. As for now, let's finish off our picture of where this country sits by briefly covering Tajikistan's external borders. If we go back to our left-facing rabbit, and starting clockwise from the southwest corner, if we work our way from the tip of the rabbit's foot, along its face, and then follow that line all the way along its ears, that would be the section of Tajikistan's border that it shares with Uzbekistan, a nation who historically has had a lot of tensions with Tajikistan and currently possesses a far more numerous and far more advanced national military, much of which is stationed less than a few hours' drive away from Tajikistan's two biggest cities. Then if we go from the tip of the rabbit's ears, running along the back of those ears, across the back of the rabbit's head, and then down the rabbit's spine, that's the part of the border that Tajikistan shares with Kyrgyzstan, a relationship currently being characterized by recent conflicts between the two, including a pretty significant clash back in 2022. Then if we go back to our rabbit, and working our way around the very right side of the rabbit, there we have the Tajik border with China's Xinjiang region, a border so remote that China only operates a single crossing through the Kulma Pass between the two of them. And then if we go from the very bottom right-hand corner of our rabbit and run along the bottom of its feet, along the belly of the rabbit, and along the bottom of its front feet, we find the border it shares with Afghanistan, a country who is a perennial source of concern for Dushanbe, as well as most of the international partners involved here in the country, with Afghanistan being a continuous source of instability, transnational threats, insurgencies, drug trafficking, and extremist movements. So, as you can probably imagine, this geographical and infrastructural challenges necessitate Dushanbe engaging in a whole series of very delicate balancing acts that not only include bolstering the nation's physical security, but also managing diplomatic engagements amongst some of the world's most influential powers. This is a pretty unique position for any country in the world, and probably the only country hosting Russian, Chinese, and Indian military facilities, as well as US and EU border programs, and potentially very soon, Turkish and Iranian arms manufacturing programs, all within this one tiny mountainous state, which again should really underscore the complexity of the geopolitical situation that Tajikistan finds itself in. Now, when discussing any military, it's always important to discuss how it's structured and why it operates the way it does, as who sits at the top and how things are unpacked actually determines quite a lot of what that military is actually capable of. So what we'll do here now is unpack the Tajik command structure in a fair bit of detail, as frankly it's a command structure that has a lot of similarities with the other 5 Central Asian republics, hence why this first episode is only focusing on one country. So the command architecture of the Tajik military and security services is a quintessential example of a centralized governance system, with a direct reporting line that frankly almost always ends at the president. And this structure is not merely by accident either. It's a calculated strategy to mitigate the risk of insurrections coming from within the nation or even from within the military ranks themselves. Effectively, it's a form of coup-proofing the administration. And this is where I want to introduce you to a concept known as packing and cracking. Let me explain. As what we see here in some of these country structures is that the leadership will take some sections of the government, usually ones that are incredibly important to the government's survival, things like telecommunications, banking, and domestic intelligence, and pack all of the decisions those guys make into just a tiny handful of very connected people they can trust. Whereas other departments that could be potentially problematic, well, what they do is the opposite. They crack them right open, compartmentalizing and carving up these departments into so many little competing or divided branches that they frankly can't really achieve anything at all. Not without getting a lot of these guys on side and all looking the same direction. Now with that in mind, let's get back to our command structure. As I said before, at the top of this command structure, with no surprises, is the president, Emomali Rahman, who both by the constitution and frankly in practice has the final word on all national security and defense decisions within the country, and even with some branches like the National Guard and the State Committee for National Security, both of which we'll go into a bit later, answering only directly to him. However, for the rest of the military, much like the other 5 republics here, on all matters of national security, the president will consult with the Security Council of Tajikistan. Now, the Security Council's primary mandate is to provide strategic counsel to the president on a pretty broad spectrum of national security concerns. However, in Tajikistan, the Security Council has been continuously consolidated over the last few years, where we're now at a point where, in comparison to a nation like Uzbekistan, who has the head of the National Human Rights Center, as well as the head of the State Committee for Defense Industry sitting on their Security Council, here in Tajikistan, the council is limited to just 9 people, effectively being just the president's most inner circle. Now, while this council does provide good advice to the president and can help direct him to making a good decision regarding national defense, it also gives him an advantage of fostering a competitive environment between these branches and services, as quite often military budgets and which service gets the most money is decided by this council, so everyone sitting around that table knows it'd be Rahman who decides how much of a paycheck they get, which probably gives them somewhat of an incentive to keep him happy. The council then taking Rahman's decision and then passing it down to the various ministries and branches. So from the Security Council, let's go down a level in the command chain, where we would arrive at those ministries and branches. This would be ministries like the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of the Interior, and the State Committee for National Security, effectively what is the modern Tajik version of the KGB. But for now, let's just look at the Ministry of Defense, as that's the main one for this series. Now, the Ministry of Defense here in Tajikistan is fairly similar to any other Ministry of Defense, being in charge of the General Staff, the Tajik Ground Forces, the Tajik Air and Air Defense Forces, and the Tajik Mobile Forces, as well as being in charge of most of the purchasing and procurement of arms and equipment coming into the country. Again, all pretty standard stuff for an MOD. Now, here in Tajikistan, the Ministry of Defense, during peacetime, gives orders to the General Staff, effectively the heads of most of the military branches, although in wartime, that usually flips around. Now, the General Staff are charged with taking the orders they get from the Ministry of Defense and then doling it out to the appropriate branches. Those branches being the ground forces, the air and air defense forces, and the mobile forces. And to start with, let's go to the ground forces. Now, the ground forces here in Tajikistan are something similar to what most people would consider the classic army in Western terms. This is where you find the majority of your infantry, your tanks, and your bigger artillery pieces. Although because of the Tajik geography, the Tajik forces place a little bit more emphasis. What is particularly interesting about the ground forces here, though, is where they're actually deployed throughout the country. You'd assume a country like Tajikistan, where almost everything is done out of the capital, that it would make sense to put the majority of our armed forces also near the capital. But here's the thing, when it comes to Tajik policy, the majority of the country's ground forces are not actually stationed anywhere near the capital, with the 1st Motor Rifle Brigade being stationed way in the south in Koragantepe, and the 3rd Motor Rifle Brigade being stationed in the north on the other side of the Hisar Range. In fact, the only ground troops kept here in Dushanbe are a very slow, hulking artillery units, as well as a handful of very specialized units, doing things like chemical warfare, agrarian work, or rapid response. In fact, when it comes to the defense of the city, the largest ground forces deployment is actually from the Russian base in the southwest of the city. Their base operates under the banner of the 201st Motor Rifle Division, where Russia keeps the 149th Guards Regiment, the 92nd Regiment, and the 783rd Battalion just in the southwest of Dushanbe. But it also keeps the 191st Motor Rifle Regiment way down in the south in Koragantepe, with the Russian base connected to the base for the Tajik 1st Motor Rifle Brigade, the only place here in Tajikistan where the two countries' bases directly connect up. Since I did bring up the 1st Motor Rifle Brigade, I thought I'd pose this question to our next guest, as our 3rd special guest here today is Katie Putz, who is not only the managing editor of the Diplomat magazine, specializing in Greater Asia, but has also previously worked with the Atlantic Council and the World Bank. So Katie, you've looked at this Tajik military in great detail before. Being able to look at these militaries side by side, how would you compare the Russian kit and the Russian bases to what the Tajik kit and the Tajik bases are like, both here in Koragantepe as well as throughout the rest of the country?
I think it's fair to say that the Russian forces are probably better equipped than the Tajik forces. That's in part a financial question. It is also an issue of who Tajikistan can be purchasing weapons from. Obviously, Russia is a major supplier, and Russia, certainly right now, has a lot of uses for its own equipment. The Tajik government has pursued partnerships with other countries, but it does face a financial question when it comes to real modern equipment. And so you do see in the Tajik military a lot of old equipment. And there are questions of how these units would operate tactically if there was a conflict that they needed to confront.
No argument from me there. As in terms of hardware, it's definitely not the Tajik ground forces' strong point. with the Tajik military being equipped with mostly limited quantities of early Russian Federation or late Soviet-era equipment, including some of the basics like small arms, armored fighting vehicles, and pretty rudimentary artillery systems, mostly integrated just within a few core motor rifle brigades. For these motor rifle units, Tajikistan predominantly relies on a handful of very old T-55s and about 60 T-72s, with only a handful of those T-72s having been fitted out with any sort of modernization kits, with most of their armored vehicles being things like BTR-60s and BTR-70s, both of which likely went into production during the mid-Cold War, spent time in Russia or Western Europe, and were probably then shipped off to Russia for storage, and were then probably donated from there into the Tajik military. Now, from some of the interviews we conducted as part of this project with Tajik personnel who are still serving in the Tajik armed forces, so we'll obviously have to remain somewhat anonymous for this, they told us that at present, many of Tajikistan's motorized assets are operating well beyond their intended service life. Then going on to tell us that significant amounts of these ground forces vehicles, although being operational on the books, are being continuously cannibalized in order to refurbish some of these later model vehicles, particularly in recent years when getting a hold of Russian parts has become more and more difficult. Now, the other big difference here between the Tajik troops and the Russian troops is to do with morale. And for that, I'm going to throw back to Bruce. Bruce, can you take us through some of the morale problems that have been going on within the Tajik ground forces?
There's forced conscription in Tajikistan, and everyone knows, this is again another thing that they probably picked up, I'm sure, from the Soviet Union, but when you go in and you're a new recruit, and chances are you're going to get beaten up by everybody else that's there. That's why people try to escape military service. And so this is the level of motivation that you have. Someone who might have been actually picked up, dragged from their apartment, or grabbed on the street, put into the military, where they get beat up by the people who have already, soldiers that have already been there 6 months or a year. They don't want to be there. Again, another old Soviet practice is you're not likely to serve anywhere near a place that you're from, which means that if you're from the south, they're going to probably send you to the Kyrgyz border. And if you're from the Dushanbe area or further east or something, then maybe you get sent all the way to the Uzbek border somewhere or something. So they're also kind of an unfamiliar territory.
Now, I'll throw back to Katie on this one. As things stand, the ground forces have somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 personnel, depending on who you want to talk to, which in terms of army size would still put them at 5th, but only just behind Kyrgyzstan. However, what the Tajiks do claim is that they could mobilize a reserve force of 600,000 men, which is approximately 42% of all fighting age males in the country, to which, if it was accurate, would make the Tajik army over 20 times larger than the current largest ground force in the region. So how credible do you think these claims actually are?
That is very unlikely. I'm just thinking about rushing every single young man into a military uniform and saying, look, I've got an army. Where would you get 600,000 weapons? The only place to get those would be Russia, and certainly you wouldn't be able to get them right now. And so it is sort of another case of essentially Dushanbe kind of cooking the books to make itself look bigger and more capable. But I'm not certain that the Tajik military as it exists now is capable of doing the missions that its military says that it is capable of doing, let alone sort of standing up a much larger active fighting force.
Which brings us to the country's air and air defense forces. As with most Soviet model militaries, the air and air defense are usually rolled in together. So to save us time across the rest of the episode, when I refer to the Tajik Air Force, I mean the Tajik Air and Air Defense Forces. Now, historically, Tajikistan has relied on Russia for its aerial support needs, and to date, this reliance has proved pretty much adequate for the minimal needs of the Tajik state. Even as far back as the Tajik Civil War, Russia and Uzbekistan were the key providers of air cover for the Tajik government. Then moving past that, Tajikistan was a participant in the joint CIS, or Commonwealth of Independent States, air defense system, which meant that Tajikistan's airspace was subject to Russian surveillance and defense protocols, but was also pretty much protected by the Russians. Now, this arrangement means that Tajikistan's entire fixed-wing fleet consists of just a handful of L-39 trainers and a couple of very old Soviet cargo planes, like the Antonov An-26 and the Tupolev Tu-134. Now, this arrangement meant that Tajikistan only had to maintain a very small helicopter fleet, rather than sustaining an obsolete fleet of Soviet-era fighters, the path taken by 3 of the 5 Central Asian states. It also meant that Russia had free reign to land its planes and helicopters anywhere in the country as it saw fit, with Russia primarily operating its jets in this region either out of Aini Air Base just to the west of Dushanbe, or out of Kant Air Base in the north of Kyrgyzstan. But when it comes back to the Tajik Air Force, their air force almost entirely consists of about 15 Soviet-made Mi-8 and Mi-24 helicopters, with the majority of these helicopters given to the Air Force, and a handful of them given to the National Guard and border forces. Most of which still even come with the paint jobs they got during the Soviet-Afghan War, meaning that Tajikistan beat us all to the 80s revival trend. But why don't they invest more into this sector? Well, to better answer that question, I want to throw to my next guest, Derek Bisaccio, the lead analyst specializing in Russia and Central Asia for Forecast International, and a very good friend of the project here. So Derek, why don't the Tajiks put more effort into their air force?
So part of it's money. And then the other part of it would be they can rely on the Russian Air Force if it's anything in particular that would require, for example, ground strikes. And as a member of the CSTO, they could lean on them. But otherwise, the sort of conflicts that Tajikistan is finding itself in are mostly ground wars. It isn't a rival in the airspace with its Central Asian neighbors. So Tajikistan is not looking at this from the standpoint of, okay, we need an air-to-air capability to deal with it because there aren't any air-to-air threats that they're really looking at. And then also the fact that they just don't have the money to then be spending on acquiring a new aircraft, a new fixed-wing platform, training up the pilots that are going to be flying that, and then also providing the fuel.
Now, there is a much longer conversation here to have about drones, but that's one we'll probably save for a future part of this series. As for now, let's just stay on Tajikistan and unpack some of these branches and how they work. Now, this trend that we see in the Tajik Air Force of most of their equipment being pretty old is something that we see in even heavier amounts within the Tajik Air Defense Forces. As whilst the Russian forces here do have some semi-decent air defense missiles sitting here, the Tajik garrison is still using things like the Zu-23, which entered service in the 1950s, as well as 2K-12s and S-125s, both of which entered service in the late 1960s. Now, this was all supposed to change, with Russia in 2019 suggesting transferring multiple of the Russian S-300 systems that were sitting within Tajikistan into the direct command of the Tajik Armed Forces, with this transfer due to occur sometime in late 2022. But for some strange reason, Russia has decided to redirect those air defense systems somewhere else. So the Tajik Air and Air Defense Forces do consist of mostly very old equipment and materials, even by regional standards. However, there is a Tajik force that does actually have some pretty good equipment. Those forces not being the ground or air forces, but instead the Tajik mobile forces. They also take their orders from the Tajik General Staff, but have a completely separate chain of command of their own, as well as completely separate bases, completely separate procurement, completely separate commanders, and operate very differently to what the ground forces do. In fact, the Tajik mobile forces are often seen as the spearhead of the nation's military capabilities, and are structured to provide rapid and versatile responses to both conventional and asymmetrical threats pretty much wherever they may occur in the country. Now, these mobile forces, when we look at them a bit closer, include things like rapid reaction units, air assault units, motorized mountain troops, as well as specialized engineering teams. Again, a significant contrast with the ground forces, which are predominantly made up of conscripts. So Derek, I'll throw it back to you. How would you describe the mobile forces?
These guys are modeled on Russia's airborne troops, although the one difference would be Tajikistan does not have the sort of fixed-wing transports that Russia has. What they're meant for is rapidly responding to a particular contingency. They've got access to helicopters that could at least allow them to get to particular sites a lot quicker. So mobile forces are really the ones that are the best well-trained. They're the ones that are often involved in exercises, for example, with the CSTO. They're the ones that are really prepared to respond to complex scenarios.
The other major difference here with the mobile troops is where they're deployed in the country. As unlike the ground troops, which if we think about our rabbit again, the ground forces are mostly deployed either halfway up the ears, or down towards the front feet, or right near the back of the tail. In contrast, the mobile forces, particularly the 7th Air Assault Brigade, are kept much closer to the capital, in fact just on the eastern edge of the capital. Now, whilst the mobile troops would be incredibly handy in the event of invasion, they also serve a second purpose for the government. And again, it all comes back to coup-proofing, as whilst the government makes sure to keep those lower morale motor rifle units way outside the capital, as a good first line of defense, they make sure to keep the 7th, which is deployed near the capital, comparatively well paid and fed, giving them more incentive to come and defend the government or the palace. In the event of something looked like it was going wrong, those forces would arrive to defend the palace much quicker than most of the other motor rifle brigades, which again is one of the reasons why Rahman has taken particular interest in who is in command of the 7th Air Assault over the years. But before we get into a long rant about that, for now, let's move on to the internal troops, with these being the troops that are under the direct command of the Ministry of Interior Affairs. And these internal troops even though they're completely disconnected from the Ministry of Defense or the General Staff, really aren't anything to be sneezed at. As whilst the ground and mobile forces have a combined around 7,300 troops, and the Air Force has around 1,500, the internal troops have about 3,800 troops, so a bit over half as big as the entire ground and mobile forces. Now, these internal troops, operating under the command of the MIA, represent an incredibly important pillar in the nation's internal security mechanisms, as these troops fulfill a dual role, both as the primary reserve force, but also as the mainstay for domestic defense initiatives, as well as public order maintenance. What that means is, in the event of a large-scale domestic uprising, the national and state police would be the first people called to come and curb those protests. As the last thing some of these governments want is to see a protest kicking off, call in the army, and risk the army flipping sides on them, which is why, like all of the other Central Asian states, the internal troops' operational framework is completely isolated from that of any of the traditional armed forces, with completely separate command structures and a completely different deployment footprint. As unlike the ground forces, where they concentrate in just a few big bases around the country, the MIA troops have bases right across the country, even in some of the much smaller cities, with most of these bases having quite small garrisons. Again, the idea being that even if a protest kicks off in one of these small towns, MIA troops can quickly rush in and crush the protest before it ever has the chance to snowball and draw in some of the surrounding villages. When it comes to their equipment though, unlike some of the other branches, the internal troops have a couple of very specialized units with pretty decent gear, but the majority of it is of pretty poor quality, with most of it, in all honesty, being tailored toward managing civil unrest more than engaging in high-intensity conflicts. The internal forces also help Ruckmon with that cracking and packing concept we talked about earlier on, where if the army was getting too powerful, Ruckmon could decide to send more troops and money toward the internal forces, depending on which one he felt was more loyal at the time. And if there was an army unit that wanted to try and take over the presidency, that unit would either have to flip both chains of command onto their side, or risk having to fire upon their own countrymen, which is probably not a good look. So again, the force can act as an insurance policy, which is why it's so interesting then that Ruckmon has another insurance policy on top of that. That policy being the National Guard, an entirely separate branch to all of the other ones. Now, the National Guard are kind of a similar organization to something like the United States Secret Service, except that they answer only to the president, have a force size of about 1/6 of the entire regular army, and stand as probably the most well-equipped segment of the nation's military as a whole, often even called to take part in national celebrations and demonstrations. So, Derek, I'll throw back to you on this one. How would you describe the National Guard?
The National Guard in particular is the one that's charged with keeping the president safe. So when he's going places, for example, he's going to be visiting a new city, they're the sort of the advance runners, if you will, that show up there to make sure that everything's looking fine, that everything's looking secure, and will provide security for Ruckmon as he's moving.
And Bruce, same question.
The National Guard really is what the president came to rely on over the years. Ruckmon's been used to that since the Civil War days, that the National Guard was really the ones that should be watching out for him.
Now, the National Guard's command structure and management don't fall anywhere within the Armed Forces command structure, and instead are directly ordered by the president himself, with even the day-to-day operational leadership of the branch being carried out by a commander who is hand-picked by the president as well. However, Ruckmon still maintains a pretty cautious approach in where he actually deploys them, making sure to always prevent deploying these units into politically sensitive areas, hoping to keep them being seen as something positive within the larger Tajik community and not stir up trouble between the National Guard and other branches of the military, which, as one of the diplomatic cables that was put out by WikiLeaks indicates, all roughly 1,200 of the National Guard soldiers enjoy vastly prioritized resources and usually get the first pick of any good equipment, meaning that within the Tajik system, what usually happens is that the National Guard comes in and pillages anything new, the mobile forces take whatever good stuff is left over, and the ground and internal forces are left to deal with whatever those guys have left behind. Therefore, it's not so unexpected that there is this reported tension between the National Guard and the ground forces. So whilst we've had the ground forces, the air and air defense forces, the mobile forces, the internal forces, and now the National Guard, there is one more branch that we have to go into, which is the border forces. This force being the one that is so often overlooked, but also the one that has started almost every conflict that Tajikistan has been involved with. You see, the Tajik Border Service operates under the direct command of the State Committee for National Security, or the SCNS, which, as we went through earlier, is something similar to a KGB-style organization, with these forces comprising of approximately 2,500 personnel. stationed across a whole range of tiny little outposts right across the country's periphery. Now, these forces are meant to serve as the initial line of defense against any incursions by foreign nations. However, these guys also face some of these significant resource limitations. Even though these forces have received quite a lot of training from organizations like the OSCE, the European Union, the former Afghan National Army, and members of the US Special Forces, there isn't really a good one-to-one comparison for a US branch that operates like this. So to really stretch a comparison here, the border force would have to imagine something like the FBI, except that the FBI only answers to the president and has its own armed forces, along with its own air force, and that this new branch of the US military would exclusively patrol along the country's borders, and had on numerous occasions entered into full firefights with Mexico over the years. That would be a somewhat close comparison of what its border force is like, as in recent history, it's the border services that have been on the front line of most of the conflicts that Tajikistan has been involved in, including disputes with Kyrgyzstan in 2011, 2014, 2021, and most crucially 2022, when incidents between the two countries initially erupted when both of their nations' border services ended up escalating the situation and began firing on each other, often without the conventional militaries having any idea this was kicking off. Now, Bruce, you've had a lot of experience with this border force. How would you describe them?
Their chain of command is very, very short because you have to be able to counterattack right away. They're used to whatever, Afghan drug smugglers, weapons smugglers, what happened along the Kyrgyz border. You can't wait for orders to get all the way to the center and then come back because you're already under attack. So they're used to that, whereas the military doesn't really have that. The chain of command seems to be much longer, where the permission to open fire could take a while. But the border guards don't seem to have that. They seem to have been given enough competence where they can say, if you are attacked, then you, on your own discretion, do what you have to repel whatever threat is coming across. Well, as opposed to like the military unit, which would have to call up the line to the command, the generals in command, and get permission to do whatever they're asking to do.
So if we look at, let's say, the recent Balkan conflict in 2022, who started shooting first, and how aware do you think the Central Command was?
In 2021 and 2022, it's still unclear who started the shooting, but it is clear who took the initiative very quickly. And the Tajik military and the border guards specifically, in both cases, not only counterattacked or started the attack, but they advanced into Kyrgyz territory. And these things usually start in shootouts with the border guards. I mean, they're the ones at the border, right? You'd have to say that the border guards could start the attack if they wanted to.
So, Derek, I'll throw to you with this. How would you describe these small border outposts that are dotted right around the periphery of the country, but predominantly along the Tajik-Afghan border?
A lot of these outposts are not particularly large. A lot of them are there so that they can keep an eye on the Afghan border in particular. There have been instances, at least once a year, once every other year, where militants from Afghanistan have either tried to infiltrate the country or they've fired on Tajik positions. I think there was an instance a couple of years back where they actually made it into Tajikistan and got to the Tajik-Uzbek border, which also shows you the distance that these guys can make it before really encountering any significant resistance. And then the other point is where these units are, they're so far out there that they might not have very many or any armored vehicles. They might just be relying on civilian vehicles to get them around. And that's not as much of a force multiplier.
However, there is another oddity that does come with the border forces, as whilst the average Tajik might dread heading into the ground forces, or be proud to join the mobile forces, a lot of Tajiks will do whatever they can to join the border forces. In fact, in some cases, we've heard stories of families pooling their money together in order to gather enough capital to be able to bribe their child onto the border force. As whilst, yes, the pay is terrible in the border force, and yes, you're often deployed in the middle of nowhere, the job can be highly lucrative, as these forces are in charge of stopping all drugs coming into the country, or possibly looking the other way when the drugs come into the country. But with this being such a complicated issue, I'm going to let our next guest take us through it, with the next guest being Edward Lemon, the president of the Oxus Society for Central Asian Affairs, who joined us recently.
There's a number of things crossing that border. Drugs is the most significant. The UNODC estimates estimate that about 30% of the economy comes from the drug trade. Something like 100 tons of heroin, opium transiting through the country each year, mostly destined for the Russian market. So that's a very significant part of the economy. Most of it's crossing via formal borders. So to be a border guard or to be a border officer in Tajikistan is something you pay a lot of money to be, or you're in networks where it's certainly a significant reward. And so most of this trade is not happening by small-scale drug peddlers putting boats across the river between the two countries. Most of it's going across the bridges, the very bridges that were built by donors such as the United States and the Aga Khan Foundation. So it's very much part of the informal economy, but it's also controlled by organized criminal groups and the state itself. So we have this sort of state-crime nexus. Other things crossing that border include, I think, tobacco, precious stones, marijuana, I think to some degree, but mostly heroin and opium is by far the most valuable commodity going across that border.
Now, weirdly enough, the Tajik border forces aren't actually the only forces patrolling Tajikistan's borders, with the nation of India also technically having military bases out here in Tajikistan, with their facilities based in the city of Farkhnor, which, if we want to think back to our rabbit again, would be roughly located on the back of the rabbit's front feet. Now, India claims it has an airbase out here, and at one point was even talking about making Aini a massive base for the Indian Air Force, before eventually just palming it off to the Russians. So, Katie, can you actually explain this to us and actually take us through what the Indian presence out here is?
When it comes to India, the word that comes to mind is Farkhnor, which is, depending on the source you read it in, a Indian military base in Tajikistan. I don't believe that that's quite true. What I know from the last time I really dug into this a couple of years ago was that India had an agreement with Tajikistan to refurbish a runway and install a hospital on what had been a former military base. Now, the runway was refurbished. There's satellite images you can look at. But what you don't see are sort of lines of Indian jets. And I think to really understand some of that discourse, you have to look at India, which, unlike Tajikistan, has a very, very loud and open media space and also has a very prominent rivalry with Pakistan. And so it serves the Indian purpose for this sort of Central and South Asia region to think that maybe India does have a base on the other side of Pakistan. It doesn't actually have to be true, but I think that's one of the reasons this keeps coming up. And so my belief is that that is essentially what was a bilateral development project that has gotten sort of blown up into something else.
And from what our research brought up, all that the Indians seem to operate out here is a small medical unit that can either be used to help Indian nationals evacuated out of somewhere like Afghanistan, or to help treat locals and provide medical services. Either way, it seems like a very non-intrusive facility down here in the south of the country. But now if we leave that medical unit aside and we travel eastwards, this is where we come across another country's bases here in Tajikistan. That country being China, with China also having a series of, well, depending on who you want to ask, bases or border patrol posts or forward customs units dotted along the very east of Tajikistan here, in the bottom right-hand corner of the rabbit, if you're still following along. So to start with, I'll throw to Katie on this one. How would you describe these Chinese bases?
I find that base really interesting because when we're talking about it, it depends on who you ask, whether it's a training facility or it's a military police facility. There's different sort of terms to use, but it is largely not sort of made a transition into an official base. And I think that has a lot to do with how the Chinese conceptualize their presence abroad. China, unlike the United States, doesn't have many bases in foreign countries. And the other part of that is its purpose isn't necessarily to broadcast Chinese power, though there certainly is an aspect in that. Anytime there's a military facility of one country inside the borders of another country, it says something about the relationship between those two countries. But China's interest is being there because they have interests in the region. They have a lot of concern about Xinjiang and the Turkestan region more broadly. And so that position in Tajikistan is valuable. But I don't see Beijing upgrading it and there being any kind of publicity around that.
Well, Derek, I'll throw to you. How do these bases compare to the Russian bases we see in Dushanbe and Korogantepe?
Much more austere than the Russian bases, and then also geographically located much more differently. So whereas the Russian, the 201st military base is really just primarily out of Dushanbe, the Chinese bases, on the other hand, are actually very, very close to the Wakhan corridor and close to China itself. They are eastern Gorno-Badakhshan. China had been pretty hush-hush about the deployment throughout the late 2010s. But there are a few villages that Chinese soldiers have been spotted in. As far as equipment's concerned, there's not a whole lot of evidence of them having anything substantial. They may have the sort of patrol vehicles that they themselves have sold to Tajikistan. There's been some of their different MRAPs have showed up in Tajik service, and some of these might also be operated by the Chinese in that area. But as far as tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, I don't believe there's all that much evidence of those being there. And then also not aircraft either. The bases that have been identified as being the Chinese bases, there aren't any airfields next to them or attached to them. It's not very linked to anything.
Which does raise an interesting question, that one of the country's major flashpoints and hotspots is out here in Gorno-Badakhshan, known as Horog. If Horog were to, let's say, be captured by an insurgent force, you would expect the Tajiks or even the Russians to be the ones to come in and kick them out. But when we look at Horog, it's actually the Chinese bases that are much closer to the action here. So if that was to occur, would you expect that the Chinese would offer to lend a hand here? Or would this be something that you think Beijing would just leave to the Tajiks and Russians to sort?
As the crow flies, they're certainly closer than the Russians are, but they also need to be going straight through the mountains to be able to get there. And given the size of the deployment that they have, I don't believe it would be substantial enough. And also politically, China and Russia have an interesting dance in Central Asia in that Chinese troops being involved in a domestic scenario like that would be the sort of thing that Russia would actually be, maybe not publicly, but would certainly be privately opposed to.
Bruce, your thoughts?
China just doesn't have an interest, especially with what's going on in Xinjiang. I mean, it would be madness to incorporate another Muslim area into your country. Not to mention, it would make Tajikistan a magnet for jihadists. They'd be coming from everywhere to try to get at the Chinese military because they've been unable to do so since the Chinese military has a very low profile outside the borders of China. So that would be a nightmare scenario for China and really for the region.
However, whilst Chinese intervention is pretty hypothetical at this point, protests and possible terrorist incursions out here really aren't, with the Tajik government having cracked down on Pannier groups out here in Gorno-Badakhshan multiple times over the last few years. So, Steve, can you take us through some of the government responses to these protests?
The May 2022 and onward crackdown led to hundreds of arrests of political figures, artists, entrepreneurs, civil society activists. So the Tajik government controls the resources, has a monopoly on state violence and roads. And what we saw in Roshan in May 2022 is that protesters, certainly outnumbered, outmanned, outgunned, still felt that they could engage in peaceful protest en masse. But what happened was that there were dozens of extrajudicial killings that we believe somewhere on the order of 50 people, all told, were killed, which was then followed by more crackdowns and mass arrests. This is going to continue to be a site of unrest and of contestation for Dushanbe for many years to come.
Now, as a part of this project, we sat down with teams of subject experts, wargaming out quite a number of the scenarios here in the region, with 3 in particular being written for the Tajik chapter. And whilst I'm very aware of the limitations that wargaming has, what it can do if done right is at least point you in the right direction. With the aim of these exercises not just to move some pretty colours around the map, but instead to see where the structural weaknesses and pinch points are within these militaries, and where the Tajik response is likely to fall short. Now, the first of these scenarios posed in the Tajik chapter is looking at the likely outcome of a group of ISKP insurgents, or just any generic insurgency, crossing the border from Afghanistan into Tajikistan and attempting to seize the largest city in the GBAO, Horog, which on our rabbit would probably sit somewhere around its back kneecap. Now, obviously these are very long findings and you could read them later on, but as a bit of a summary here, the remoteness of the city of Horog absolutely shaped the outcome of this conflict, as even on a good day, Horog is a 24-hour drive away from Dushanbe, with this absolute distance and remoteness serving as a giant double-edged sword for the exercise. For the insurgent team, it meant that they could only cross the border with pretty much what they could carry, which in theory would make it much easier to push them out of the city. But for the Tajik defense team, things weren't great either, as whilst these insurgents should have been incredibly easy to dislodge, the Tajik garrisons out here in Horog had no access to armor, no access to air support, and no logistics train to speak of. And whilst the insurgents failed to make it very far into the city, even in an optimistic scenario, it took nearly 4 days for the first Tajik and Russian reinforcements to arrive here in the city. A journey that could have been much, much longer if the team of insurgents had moved into firing positions overlooking the isolated, long and narrow roads that separate Horog from the rest of the country. This was such a difficult environment to operate within that even when the Tajik team was given full Russian support, air power-wise, it made very little difference to the final outcome, as there is nowhere near the city to be able to land a helicopter safely, meaning that any Russian helicopters would have to take off from Aini, west of Dushanbe. And this is the same problem the Russians have with their drones, as the tiny airstrips in the east of the country have no facilities to be able to restock and refuel these drones, meaning that all of the drone flights carried out here in Tajikistan would again have to launch from Aini Air Base, which is about a 400-kilometer journey away from the battlefield here, meaning that even if our Russian drone was in good working condition, we'd only get about 90 minutes loitering time over the target before we'd have to then just head back to Dushanbe, making our drone here pretty much useless. What we found is the geography and remoteness out here, whilst on one hand make defending the country incredibly easy. It's this geography that frankly kept Tajikistan safe for so many centuries. That same geography also made it incredibly difficult to reinforce and incredibly difficult to operate within. And whilst reading these results, some people's first thoughts might be to simply just forward deploy more troops, so that way you don't have to rely on troops coming in from Dushanbe. The trouble is, when this has been done in the past, it's often just made the situation worse, as almost inevitably tensions begin boiling up between the soldiers and the locals. And eventually there's a higher chance that you end up with wide-scale protests in the area, pretty much defeating the purpose of sending these soldiers in the first place. So Derek, I'm going to throw this at you first. What was your read on the situation? How much was the geography a real deciding factor here?
I think attempting to launch a military operation like that would be extremely difficult for them to move equipment and to move it fast enough in a time frame that would require by rail for part of it. Otherwise, it's going to be by road. And if they're getting into Gorno-Badakhshan, you only have one mountain road. Well, if you're dealing with militants in a hypothetical scenario, they might have effectively cut off that road. Well, now you have to clear them before you can even get to whatever the problem area was.
So Steve, you know this area incredibly well, and whether it's a local protest or whether it's an incursion by an insurgent force, what do you think the best solution to this problem is? Is there a military solution, or should Dushanbe be looking elsewhere for how to secure its position here in the east?
Michael, I'm glad you're asking a question about what the Tajik government could actually do constructively to solve the situation. Of course, what sparked the most recent crisis was in November 2021 with the murder of a local girl and the uprising of the population, which felt that Dushanbe was not listening to them, that it wasn't allowing self-governance. They wanted to have their own governor, and the removal of the Pannier governor and the replacement with an official from Dushanbe is really what sparked the current crisis. And so one thing that Rahmon could immediately do would be to consult with the bodies that still exist and try to come to some agreement about who the political officials that would govern the territory. There was an entity called Commission 44, which actually the government had authorized to negotiate with it. It included individuals such as Faramuz Ergashev, who now has almost a 30-year prison sentence, having been arrested in 2022. So that would be one. I think two, though, is allowing for more economic autonomy, free trade. We had this famous marketplace that occurred between, again, the free trade where Pamiris could cross the border into Tajikistan for 1 day a week and cross back. There needs to be more economic ties that are allowed, despite the concerns that exist. And I think also religious freedom is very important to the Pamiris. So their ability to actually openly and peacefully engage in Shia and Ismaili Islam. And that means, for example, allowing Pamiris to put back up the portrait of the Aga Khan, who they revere, who they regard as their spiritual leader. His portraits have been forcibly taken down in the last several years.
As with Dushanbe giving some concessions on these sort of fronts, would prevent them from having to do some massive logistical overhauls or risk deploying a whole bunch of units above what they have at the moment out here permanently. Now, the second scenario was detailing the possibility of Russia attempting to carry out a coup here in Dushanbe, and what units Moscow would need to flip over to their side in order to carry out the regime change quick enough as to avoid any risk of civil war. Now, for Russia, as things stand currently, it would be highly unlikely that they would ever attempt anything like this. As out of all the Central Asian leaders, it's actually probably Rahmon that has the best working relationship with Putin. In fact, just a few days ago, the two of them left this year's Victory Day parade holding hands with one another, whilst the other Central Asian leaders walked behind them. What is a little less certain, though, is how Moscow will feel about Rustam Emomali, Rahmon's favourite son, who right now is very much being groomed to take over the country. So Bruce, to answer the first question first, how likely do you think a Russian coup could be out here? And second, if one was carried out by a local Tajik garrison, how likely would it be that the Russian garrison would jump into support?
As long as Rahmon's loyal to what the Kremlin wants, there is no reason to fool with this. Again, no one wants to see instability.
So now it seems like there's a very high probability of Rustam entering power here in Tajikistan. Do you think Russia has anything to worry about him compared to his father?
Would he change Tajikistan's foreign policy? I have not seen any evidence that would suggest that. We often see Rustam attending his father in other important meetings. They will be pictured side by side at various important events. And so I think some of that is going to depend on the method of succession and sort of what else is happening. If his father dies and he's suddenly president and his father's not there to sort of oversee things, that might go in one direction. But if you have a more managed succession and you have Rahmon as the elder statesman, in the way that in Turkmenistan, the president stepped aside, let his son run for president, but then kind of made himself super president. But in the Tajik context, it would be interesting to watch what the dynamics between father and son would be if they were sort of switched. That said, I haven't seen any evidence that Rustam, for example, would be less of a friend to Russia or less interested in Chinese engagement. I think a lot of the structural features that drive those relationships would still be true, regardless of who was president.
And what do you think would happen if Rustam did decide to push back on Russia?
Oh, that's a good question. I think Russia's response to that on the surface would be very muted. And then the real response would be on some of the social and economic levers and pressure points that Russia has on Tajikistan. The first among which is migrant workers and access for Tajiks to the Russian labor market. That's been a very important pillar of the Tajik economy for the last 30 years. And so Russia does have pressure points on Tajikistan, could make access to Russia more difficult, could scrap visa-free travel. There are levers in that area. I don't think Russia's response would be of military force, but I certainly think there would be a lot of spies getting very busy in causing problems for the Tajik government in its new enlightened state.
The third and longest exercise we played out for this report was looking at the scenario of a Tajik incursion being launched from Isfara, a city effectively at the tip of the rabbit's slick back ears, southward into Kyrgyzstan, pretty much the exact scenario we saw back in 2022. Except this time, the Tajiks go into it wholeheartedly and preemptively, rather than it being a couple of pot shots on the border that kind of spirals out of control. The scenario's findings are roughly about 25 pages long, which is probably a bit too much to cover here. But if there is interest or some demand for it, I'm sure we could take those pages and make it into a separate video. So if there is some interest in that, let me know in the comments. But for now, and spoiler alert I guess, the entire situation does not go well for the Tajiks. As even if the Tajiks managed to move up their troops without being detected by the Kyrgyz, and managed to launch the attack with a surprise, and even managed to take a couple of Kyrgyz towns, the Tajik forces almost immediately find themselves between a rock and a hard place, where they can't really go any further forward, because the Tajik army really doesn't have the logistical infrastructure to be able to facilitate any sort of large offensive move, as we found that the Tajiks' offensive caps out at about 30 kilometers from the border. In fact, just to give you an idea of how bad things really are for the Tajiks, even just taking a look at the Tajik rail network for a second reveals some of the major structural challenges that Tajikistan is likely to come up against. For example, the fact that Tajikistan's northern rail network isn't really designed to facilitate the Tajiks, and it's pretty much there for the Uzbeks. That's why it enters the country from Uzbekistan, runs south of Khojand, and then straight back into Uzbekistan afterwards. Effectively just in the rabbit ear and out the other side. And then if we look at the southern rail network, the one that connects to the capital, the Tajiks' rail system only runs between Dushanbe and some of Uzbekistan's southern cities. Without entering Uzbekistan, there is not a single rail line that connects the north of the country to the south of the country. And the Tajiks have very limited access to trucks that can carry some of their larger tanks. And if they were ever to try and attempt to drive those tanks from the bases towards the front line, I'd be willing to wager $100 so that less than 10% actually make it to the front line with their gearboxes intact. Now ignore the fact that Tajikistan has incredibly little amount of fuel trucks, pumping stations, field repair stations, spare parts, an acceptable amount of artillery shells that didn't see the Berlin Wall come down. All of these issues very quickly compound for the Tajik forces, which is pretty much why no matter how you play it, the Tajiks can't get very far into the offensive. And the trouble is, even if they were to try and take these towns and then bite and hold, that really isn't a viable strategy for them either. As not only would the Kyrgyz air power, particularly some of the Turkish drones they've been buying, likely cause the Tajik the exact same kind of headaches that these drones caused the Armenians in Karabakh, but the Kyrgyz are eventually going to bring their garrisons upon you as well. And above all of that, this is not something that Russia or anyone in Central Asia would want to happen. As for the Central Asian states, news stories about ongoing wars inside the region are likely to drive away outside investment, giving all of these states an incentive to force Tajikistan to retreat back over the border. Now, very quickly, you can have Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan close the border, and supplies are going to very quickly dry up here in Tajikistan. But the big card to play is that Russia simply cancels those working visas, or even just sends all of these angry Tajiks back to Tajikistan at once, blaming the government for this action, all of which are very simple moves by these regional governments that are almost certain to cause massive national problems. But Derek, I know you are a resourceful person, so if you were put in charge of the Tajik military, how would you attempt to carry this out?
Okay, so full disclosure, no, I don't think it's achievable. But at that point, if I've been tasked with that, it's probably you need to have an answer and you need to be able to solve this. One of the big challenges is that infrastructure issue. If Tajikistan wants to be able to launch any sort of offensive operations, and this is something for Central Asia watchers to look for, is it really needs to do a lot to update its infrastructure. Because as it stands, if they wanted to launch an operation into Batken, well, it's going to be pretty darn obvious, right? They're going to be bringing a lot of armored vehicles on the roads. They're going to be bringing a lot of people up there, and it's going to take a while. The equipment problem is that for them to start launching any sort of offensive, it's going to be very, very noticeable for very, very far in advance. And that would mean that Kyrgyzstan would have ample time to reinforce itself. So I think the main factors here would be they do need new equipment and they also need new infrastructure. I also think there's a very low probability of Kyrgyzstan or Tajikistan attempting a war that would attempt to take territory from the other or substantial amounts of territory. But even in that, what would be most likely is that Russia would lean on its leverage to bring it to a close. So rather than the Russians involve themselves directly, they could pull a lot of different political and even still some economic levers that would bring the combatants to a close. Now, how they'd feel about that is a different story, right? Whichever one got invaded, of course, might not look at the Russian support as all that helpful. And that's a big problem for Russia in its foreign policy, is that their friends in the CSTO do not feel like the Russians have really come out and done what an ally would in the same way that NATO does. Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and to another extent, Uzbekistan, a lot of their people will go to Russia for work. Both will benefit from it. Russia needs the labor, and these workers, these migrant workers that go abroad, need the income because they need to send it back as remittances to their families back home. And that figure is no small figure. Tajikistan, something like 50% of GDP annually is coming to them in remittances. And from a population of Tajikistan of something about 10 million, that offers Russia a lot of leverage, as they can lean on either the remittance flows themselves or they can start pushing migrants back out and back to Tajikistan. That would bring a lot of pressure on Rahmon's government, as these are a lot of people who would be very upset. They're young, they're unemployed, they're not making any money. The last thing that Rahmon wants is them all being pushed right back to his country empty-handed and very angry.
Now, obviously, there was much more to cover here on this one. However, for now, here are the key takeaways that I took away from all this. 1, that none of these 5 militaries is ready to invade any one of their other neighbors. And it's why a region that was at one point very, very hostile to one another is now slowly becoming more and more integrated. The second thing I would point out is that, frankly, it would take a massive amount of effort for any of these nations to wean themselves off of Russian arms, something we'll go into in much greater detail in either part 2 or part 3 of this. Thirdly, across all 5 of these militaries, the real Achilles heel seems to always be logistics. The fourth point I take away from this is that whilst Russia is having some serious troubles in Ukraine, out here in Central Asia, it still has a fairly strong position, both economically and militarily. However, I would also point out that Russia's position is nowhere near as strong as it was just 3 years ago, and that Russia's position within the region is only slowly getting weaker as well. And the fifth thing I'd point out is that of all the criticisms I might have leveled towards the Tajik military here, I am, for one, not criticizing the men and women of the Tajik army at all. In fact, I've met quite a lot of you over the years and have enjoyed pretty much each and every interaction. And 2, although the Tajik military couldn't go on any big, long expeditionary missions, it is kind of doing its job quite well. It maintains a fairly stable border with Afghanistan, and it still very much serves its purpose as the insurance policy for the government, which, in all honesty, is pretty much exactly what it's been designed to do. Which, if there was only just one big lesson to take away from all of this, it would be that these militaries are built for one specific purpose and have trained for a long time to do that one purpose very well. But whilst it's highly unlikely we'll see Kazakhstan invading China anytime soon, they are very good at maintaining regime security. And when it comes to some of the others we'll be covering a bit later on, very good at a few other types of operations as well. But that's for part 2. Thank you so much for checking out this episode, and we hope the alternative format didn't throw you off too much. Now that we've reached the end of the episode, I can unpack this project a little bit more for you. This mini-series here is the first public part of a much bigger project, where myself, as well as a dedicated team of Central Asia experts, have been interviewing and working with specialized think tanks, defense firms, academic experts, national ministries, defense economists, military defectors, and local journalists to try and piece together a centralized compendium of one of the least understood militaries anywhere in the world. The project, once completed, sometime late this year, we'll see the public release of not only the other 2 parts of this miniseries, but also the public version of a 500-page analysis of the team's findings and reports alongside charts, maps, graphs, and everything else to match, all of which being released alongside full interactive maps with nearly all of the military locations across these 5 states being laid out for anyone to take a look at. Effectively, finally giving the Central Asia analyst community a resource that frankly every other theatre seems to already have. So, a lot of big things to be coming out part by part over the next 6 months. But if you don't like Central Asia, you only have to put up with 3 episodes across the rest of the year. But if you want to find out when we do release all those reports, you can find all of that information alongside our links and info on Twitter, Reddit, Blue Sky, Mastodon, Threads, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, and TikTok on the handle @TheRedLinePod. Or if you're keen to follow me on Twitter, I'm on the handle @MikeElliotOz. Oz is in Australia. While this isn't technically a Redline piece, we will keep some traditions, as here are our 3 book recommendations. The first of which being Sinostan by friend of the show, Raphael Pantucci, for a great look at the power dynamics unfolding here in Central Asia between Russia and China. The second being The Russian Way of War by Lester W. Grau and Charles K. Bartels, for a pretty thorough crash course in Russian and Soviet military terminology and tactics. And the third is The Military and the State in Central Asia by friend of the show, Erica Murat, for another pretty great study on the militaries of Central Asia. I want to thank this week's guests, Bruce Pannier, Steve Swerdlow, Katie Putz, Derek Bisaccio, and Edward Lemon. All of you were absolutely fantastic throughout this. Now, usually this is where I thank all of the primary researchers for this piece, but for obvious reasons, I'm going to have to just keep it to Redline researchers today, them being Andrew Gundel, Daniela Givella, Ben Nutter, and Nate Ostiller. In addition to that, I'd also like to thank the rest of my team, that being Cameron Gale, the producer, Jack Schenkman, the production manager, Daniela Givella, Nate Ostiller, Robbie Sutton, Nick McNally, Jemima Pentreath, Ben Nutter, Genevieve Dolan May, Perry Grace, Gabriel Lane, Lorenz van Kierbelk, Mason Wise, Andrew Gundel, Isaac Gibbs, Andrew Garbury, Scott Missler-Ferguson, and Sean Cotter-Lem, our research assistants and writers, Jamie Tanner, our media director, Raul Devanarayanan, our OSINT analyst, Francis Leach, our director of breaking news, Mark Spencer, our second voiceover artist, Kashyap Maheshwari and Alexander Woolgarden from our online team, Jonah Gunn, our production assistant, Alexei Heimakainen, our Discord moderator, Joe Hawthorne, our audio cleaner, Marissa Rafter, our videographer, and Nick Much, our field correspondent. As I always say, this is the team that makes the show what it is today. And lastly, the Armed Forces of Central Asia will be back sometime soon. But the Red Line will be back in a fortnight with another international episode. So until then, and good night.
The views and opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of Michael, our guests, and the Redline podcast. They do not represent any government or organization and are solely our own. For more information, please visit theredlinepodcast.com.